history, so I'll try to delve into all of them. And I want to make sure I don't talk for more than a half hour because I want to leave lots of time for questions and discussion. So just the one thing I'll add to the kind introduction is my third book came out this past fall called City of Dreams, and that's the history of immigrant life in New York City that you were describing.
I've got a copy of it here. I got it out of the library.
Yep, there it is.
Interesting read.
Thank you. Thank you. So as you can see, this is my attempt at a magnum opus.
It is.
So
I'm wondering where volume 2 is coming out.
Well, very often, while I was writing it, I thought, I should make it 2 books because it's so big. It's 700 pages. But this is something, for those of you who want to write and publish, that you can think about it. Is my first book came out 25 years ago, and in truth, 25 years ago, I was already thinking about this book and imagining that one day, I hoped that if everything went well, I could do kind of a magnum opus that would be my attempt to, if I was ever going to win a big prize, this was going to be it. If I was ever going to be famous on TV, this is it. That was my goal. And my goal was to kind of speak to a big audience, a big enough audience that I'd get invited to things like this. And so I've succeeded, thanks to you. I love talking about writing, and I don't get the chance very often. In fact, I just for the first time this past semester at GW, where I teach, taught a course just on writing. Usually we historians have to teach history and facts and what happened. Even though writing is such a crucial aspect of being a historian, we tend to focus on what happened, and we leave our students to their own devices in terms of writing. And then when I'll work hard on the students writing with them, I'll always get the reaction from a portion of the class, "Oh, I didn't know this was an English class." So I decided to have a course that was just on writing so that nobody would be surprised that would be the focus. And they got to choose the history topic that they focused on, and then the course focused on how you do a good job of bringing your story to life. And so I've kind of written, in a sense, 3 different kinds of books, but I think they all, in a sense, the story of all of them can teach you guys something. So my first book, as I said, came out 25 years ago. It was called Nativism and Slavery. It was my PhD dissertation. And it ended up getting a lot more publicity than I expected. So the first thing I learned, one of the important things I learned from that project is never underestimate the potential size of your audience. So I wrote this book. It was a PhD dissertation. I thought, I could imagine 20 or 30 people reading it, right? And maybe some students. But then, much to my delight and surprise, it got reviewed in the New York Times. So at that point, there's this huge audience for the book, but the book at this point it's full of footnotes, and it was not written with the belief that it could reach that audience. And so what I discovered was, so once it got reviewed in the New York Times, all these bookstores bought the book because they just buy every book that the New York Times reviews because they think people will come in. And then it didn't sell that many because people went into the bookstore, they looked at the books, and the print is so small, so many footnotes on each page. And so what I learned from that is, and I had even talked with the editor about possibly, maybe we should put the notes in the back, maybe the print should be bigger, and the editor said, no, who's going to read this book? And I said, people are always interested in immigration. It's always a hot topic, right? This is 1992. I said, immigration is always a hot topic, and maybe it'll attract some attention. The editor was like, no, I don't think so, but if you really want us to, we could aim it more towards a popular audience. I was like, oh, no, I guess you're right. And so I wished, in retrospect, that I had listened to my gut instinct, which was this could have an appeal to more people, and I could have pushed the publisher, and they would have packaged the book so that it would have, once it made it to the bookstore, it would have been more appealing. So at that point, I learned always trust your instinct, that you know your work better than anyone else. And that came into play with my second book. So my second book, the first book was about anti-immigrant sentiment, this anti-immigrant political party called the Know Nothing Party that was very popular for a few years in the 1850s. And I decided, having written a book that talked about immigrants from the nativist point of view, I wanted to do something that let the immigrants tell their side of the story. So and at this point I was teaching at the University of Wyoming. I left New York, where I had lived my whole life, and went to Laramie, Wyoming, population 18,000. But I wanted to still kind of have an excuse to go back to see my family, who were all in New York. So I decided I would write a book about one immigrant neighborhood, kind of a micro history, and to kind of give a sense of what immigrant life was like by looking, closely at the lives of individual immigrants. And so I cast about looking for a subject. And here was another important lesson I learned was that good librarians are just the best thing a writer can have, especially I think it's for fiction and nonfiction, because I have friends who are novelists, and yet they do a lot of research to try to get accurate detail about the characters they've created. And so in either case, librarians are great. And so when you find a good librarian, when I find them, I bring them presents, I send them email, I do everything and it pays the most amazing dividends. For my first book, the hard thing was, because the Know Nothing Party was a secret society, they burned their records typically, and they didn't write things down, but every once in a while they wrote things down. And I was doing research at Yale University in the library, and the librarian asked my topic and gave me the box of manuscripts I wanted, which was about a Republican Party figure who had stuff in his papers about the Know Nothings who he didn't like. And I'm working several hours, and then the librarian comes by the table, and she has this printout from a computer, and this is the 1980s, this is like 1987, so like computer databases were very new. And she says, do you know about this collection in Canandaigua, New York? It looks like they have the minute book of a Know Nothing Lodge. And I didn't know anything about this. And just because this librarian was so diligent and thought, I'm going to see if I can help him learn more about his subject. And I've had things like that over and over again in my career. In fact, I'm still in touch with one of those librarians who was a librarian at the New York Public Library. And that was a library where a lot of the librarians were kind of just punching their time card and counting the days till retirement or till their break, and they wouldn't be helpful at all. And this one librarian was just a gem. And she's now at the University of Arkansas, and she's the head librarian for the entire University of Arkansas system. But every once in a while, out of the blue, I get an email from her. Hey, Tyler, I remember you said you're working on this. I found this cool source. Have you heard of it? And so this is just the kind of thing that helps me forever. So my suggestion is befriend librarians. And you've got great librarians even, in Alexandria and Arlington. I find them all the time, people who just happen to be in a public library because they like it, because it's where they started, because it's convenient to home, but often they have great ideas. And so that second book I started writing, and my first book won a couple of awards, and I was at this conference where I won one of these awards, and they gave you this little badge that had a little thing on it that said award winner. And so all these editors came up to me and asked what my next book was, and I told them I'm going to write about this one little immigrant neighborhood in New York. And this one editor I met said, oh, that doesn't really interest me. Do you have anything after that? And I said, well, one day I hope to write a history of immigrant life in New York from the first Dutch settlers to the present. And he said, oh, I like that. When you're ready to do that, you come back and see me. So I said, okay. And I started working on my book, and I had it about 2/3 written, the book on 5 points. And I saw him again at a conference, and I said, I really think my book has some potential for a trade audience, not just academic. And he said, oh, I'm sure it doesn't. But when you're done with your other book, let me know. And so here again, we're following your gut instinct, I think, was really important. So I left the conference, and I wrote him an email. I said, Bruce, I really think it has trade potential. And he said, I understand the trade audience. It really doesn't, but just send it to me anyway, and I'll take a look. And so I sent it to him, and he wrote back, and he said, you're right, this does have trade potential. We'd like to publish it. Please go get yourself an agent, because I don't want to take advantage of you. So I got an agent, and this is this book that became 5 Points. And one of the nice things about that book was it got me, and you're the screenwriter, right?
Yes, sir.
So one of the nice things about that was it got me introduced to Martin Scorsese, who was at that point, when I was finishing this book on 5 Points, working on this movie, Gangs of New York. Have any of you seen this movie, Gangs of New York? Yeah, so this is a movie that's set in 5 Points. And so he asked me, through his people, like a phone call, would I read the screenplay and give him comments on its historical accuracy. And so they flew me, so I said sure, and they sent me the screenplay, and they flew me to New York, and I went and I sat in a room kind of like this, but without a light. But otherwise, they did film me. They like filmed everything. But it was a room with lots of people, and Martin Scorsese sat right there where you are, and they asked me to go through page by page, and every page of the screenplay had an historical inaccuracy. I mean, every page. And so I go, page 1. Well, this thing, your movie is set in the 1860s, and this thing you have here took place in the 1890s, and it's really not accurate. And Scorsese would say, oh yeah, I know that's the case, but that scene has to be that way because it appeared to me in a dream, and my dreams are really important to me in terms of creative inspiration, and so when I have these vivid dreams, I put them in my film. So I was like, okay. And then I get to the next page here, another inaccuracy. He says, yeah, I know that one's not true, but that scene is an homage to a scene in the 1926 film Battleship Potemkin, and that's why that scene has to be that way. So what can I say? I'm like, all right, you're the boss. I go to the next page. All right, this scene also, this was a scene that I particularly remember. It's a scene where, if you've seen the movie, you might remember it. It's in the New York docks, and there's a boat that's just landed, and immigrants are coming off the boat. And the shot pans to the immigrants coming off the boat, and then the immigrants are going to a table on the dock where they're becoming citizens, and then it keeps panning, and there are other immigrants who are at another table signing up to serve in the Civil War, and then it keeps panning, and there's another table, or there's another ship, and the soldiers are with their uniforms are getting on the ship, and it keeps panning, and it gets back to here where the original ship was. But by the time it's gone 360, there's another ship there, and it's with coffins coming off from the battlefield where other immigrants have died in the Civil War. And so I said, oh my God, there are like 10 things wrong with that. You couldn't become a citizen right off the boat. And anyway, and so I said, yeah, I know all that, but that scene is going to blow the mind of every director because I go 360, and when I get back here, where's that other ship? And they have to keep in mind this is the 1990s. Now now my kids could probably do that on their iPhones making movies. But in those days, that was super complicated. And he said, that's going to blow every director's mind how I managed to make that ship disappear and be replaced by a different ship while I'm panning around. So I was like, okay. But what I learned is that Martin Scorsese knew every historical inaccuracy in the movie. He had the most amazing collection of New York City history books that I had seen. All these books published in the 1850s and 60s, original editions in the original leather binding. But what he said was, what he said to me was, he said, you should no more learn history from a film than you should from an opera. He said, my job is, my job is making art, and I can't worry about individual details for telling my story. And my story is that the immigrants came, they were discriminated against, sometimes they were persecuted, but they persevered, and eventually they became Americans. And he said, as long as I convey that theme, the details really have to be subservient to the storytelling. And that's perfectly reasonable. But that brings me to, my most recent book, where this challenge was, as you can see, big book, was trying to take 400 years
Jeez.
and make it a story with a narrative. And so that brings me to what I think is the most important thing that writers always have to keep in mind is that the narrative arc always has to be at the front of your mind, that every single paragraph has to serve the purpose of getting your story from the beginning to the end. And one of the hardest things that we writers have is letting go of things that aren't crucial to that goal. And so, for me, as a historian, when I'm in the archives, I find great stuff all the time and great stories, and I'm like, oh, what a fabulous story. I have to find some way to put that in. But, the book is 700 pages. It's 24 chapters. It was originally 26 chapters. And so I cut 2 chapters just because every time, I don't want to lose the reader's attention. And I want the reader always to understand how what they're reading is part of the narrative. And so I think that's a really important thing always to keep in mind. And so I am constantly thinking about both the narrative arc and I'm thinking about my reader's attention span. And my feeling is if you have any doubt, cut it out. Because if you're not sure the reader's going to like it, then the reader's probably not going to like it because you tend to become much more attached to your own writing. And sometimes I would write a beautiful little piece on maybe some particular immigrant. But then I would constantly think, all right, is this good enough that the reader's not going to be bored and want to skip to the next thing? And so that's what I was constantly asking myself as I wrote this book. And that's how I handed in a 26-chapter manuscript, and I, in the end, ended up with 24. And actually, yeah, I cut 2 chapters entirely. Actually, I had 27, and I made 24. Halfway through, I handed in the first half, and by the time my editor had read it, I said, you know what, let's take those first 2 chapters and make them 1. And then, so 3 in the end I got rid of, and that's constantly something I'm thinking about.
I was wondering, do you mind telling us what those 3 chapters were?
Sure. So at first I had kind of, the first 2 chapters became 1. So I now have 1 chapter on Dutch New York, when New York was New Amsterdam. I originally had one that was kind of on its discovery and founding, which is kind of the story of Henry Hudson and Peter Minuit and the famous sale of Manhattan Island. And then I had a second chapter on what life was like in this new immigrant city under Peter Stuyvesant and the Dutch rule. And I decided that, most readers are going to come to this book and they want to learn about their own, every reader I think is interested in their own story. And so, if you've got Italian immigrants in your background, you want to get to the Italian chapter as soon as possible. If you've got, Chinese immigrants in your background, you want to get to the Chinese part. And overall, there are very few Dutch Americans, especially few Dutch American New Yorkers. If you're not from like Holland, Michigan or something, not very many. And so I decided, I just got to compress that. I can't have the reader get bored in chapter 1. And so I just cut everything I thought wasn't essential. And so Henry Hudson is pretty much gone. Even though Henry Hudson it's an amazing, his story is amazing. He's supposed to be going in the other direction. The people who pay him say, do not go west. We know there is no way to get to Asia going west. We want you to go east, only east. And he takes their money, and what he does? He goes west. And then he's convinced that he's going to find a way through to Asia. And eventually his men mutiny, and they put him in a dinghy and cast him away, and they sail home to Europe, and he dies up in the, in the kind of what's now the very northern wilds of Canada in the Arctic Circle, where they kind of set him and his son in a little boat and leave him. So I thought that was a great story, but then in the end I was like, all right, it's not really an immigrant story though, so that's not in there. And then the other 2 chapters I cut, I had a chapter on a chapter on immigrants and food, and of how immigrant food made New York's food culture. And I had a chapter on immigrants and sports. And the sports stuff, and so what I did was about half the material was eliminated and half got moved into various chapters.
That's what I was going to ask.
And for the food, the same thing. So I still have stuff about, the New York deli. I still have stuff about the origins of New York pizza. But then I had other stuff that just wasn't as interesting, I thought, but that I had put in because I thought I needed it to have a whole chapter and to have equal parts on all the different ethnic groups. So that was what I did.
Could have floated the food part perhaps in a magazine.
Correct.
And draw people into the book.
That was my original intention, and then I just ran out of time and energy, but yeah. And so I sent that to the New York Times Magazine, and they rejected it. And then I was like, oh, I just don't want to work on this anymore. So I have a new book I'm working on that I'm excited about. So I was like, no, I'm not going to keep reworking a magazine article when I could be working on my next book. So.
Can I ask you the same old boring question as last writers, and that is the writing process is always a different answer from each author. Even when they write a different book, it can be a different answer. And so the writing process for this big one here for 700 pages, what was the writing process? And did you know that it would be 500, 600, 700 pages?
I didn't think this story could be told in a short book or even a medium-sized book. So I originally outlined 16 chapters, and then it just had so much good material on like the Civil War. I knew I needed to cover the New York draft riots because that's kind of famous and important in telling the story of immigrants in New York. I didn't know that so many New York immigrants volunteered and fought and played important roles in so many battles. So I had a whole chapter, 2/3 of a chapter on the draft riots, and then I felt like I needed 2/3 of a chapter on the immigrant service in the war, and it was too big for one chapter, so that became two. So there are just several places where I ended up taking what was one and making them into two, so that's how I got from 16 to 24. But then in terms of the process, I'm a big believer in outlining, and that's so because of how important I think that narrative arc is. That, and I don't know how, I'm not a novelist, so I don't know how novelists work, though I sometimes read what novelists say about their process, and I know a lot of novelists outline very thoroughly. But, so I feel like I don't want to go off on tangents, and I want my reader always to understand how everything fits into the narrative arc. And so I outline very carefully, and then I try to follow the outline. And the key thing, the thing I find the hardest are the transitions between one part of the story and the next. And so the thing I outline in the most detail is the transitions. How am I going, what am I going to end with in the chapter on Eastern European Jews that will be a good segue into Italian immigrants? And what am I going to end with Italian immigrants that's going to be a good segue into, in this case, the chapter after the Italian immigrants is one about kind of reform movements. People want to improve the tenements, improve working conditions, those things. And so that's the thing I think about the most, because I can get stuck for weeks trying to figure out how to logically get from one part of the story to the next. And so in order to not get stuck for weeks that way, I try to plan that part the most carefully. I don't always, sometimes I write, I think all writers sometimes write themselves into corners, and I do that sometimes, and it's so frustrating. Because I'll just find something that I didn't expect, and it takes the story in a different direction, and then, oh my gosh, how am I going to get from here back to where I need to be? And I sometimes sit there for days staring at the screen, just, how am I going to do it? How can should I cut this out? Should I move it? Should I change the beginning of the next chapter? So I struggle with that. That's the thing that keeps me up at night. I don't tend to lose sleep over over words or over the story. I lose sleep over how am I going to make this all fit together.
Don't you talk to other historians or people who were intellectually stimulating that might give you an idea as to how to tie those pieces together from their point of view?
Probably not as much as I should. So when I taught at the University of Wyoming, because it's a small town, kind of all the faculty kind of stuck together and spent a lot of time together, and we talk a lot. At GW, I don't know if your workplace is like this, but everybody lives in a different part of the metropolitan area. So we got people in Maryland, people in DC, people in Virginia, people in far out Virginia, people in close in Virginia. And so people tend to come in, do their teaching, and then leave. Whereas in Wyoming, everybody worked in their office 9 to 5. And at GW has the students, I can imagine. So at Wyoming, the students were very deferential. They never want to bother you. Oh, I can't bother the professor. He's too important. And these students, when I taught at the University of Wyoming, they were paying $200 a semester. That was how much the university cost. So they felt like, oh, it's not worth it. Whereas the GW students are paying $50,000 a year. They're like, he owes me, so I'm going to go to his office hours, and I'm going to be, and I'm going to stay for an hour, and I don't care how many people are out there online. I'm going to get my money's worth. And so it's hard to get work done in the GW offices as a result, because there are constantly students around looking for someone to talk to for some reason. So people tend to write at home, and as a result, that becomes more difficult. And every once in a while, I started a writing group among the faculty, and I couldn't get other faculty to go. That was the thing, because they would often say, I teach on these days, you're holding the writing thing on Friday, that's like my one day where I can write from 9 to 5. If I have to come into a writer's group, I lose my one absolute writing day. And so...
It sounds so familiar to me.
Does it? Yeah. And so it's been a real struggle. And so I miss that. I miss having, and so...
What about historian societies or support groups online? I belong to one that they come out, a group of historians, and they present a problem and ask others for what's your thought on this, or whether they know any sources.
Well, what I did instead is I became part of a writing group of faculty from all around the Washington metro area who all write on immigration. And that's been more successful because everybody's interested in the same topic. Whereas at GW, nobody really knows. I'm the expert on immigration, so there isn't anybody else who's really interested in immigration among the historians. And so, but yeah, but that is one of the complicated things. But yes, it's one of those things that I should probably be more proactive about. So that's why I'm glad you guys have this thing. And why I agreed to come on a Saturday, even though I'm usually doing other things on a Saturday, because I thought, a writers group, that's the kind of group I want to talk to. So.
Talking about Scorsese, you said his narrative arc was something like the immigrants came, they encountered adversity, and ultimately triumphed. That's very simple, and I can't, there's a lot of history to hang on that. How complex of a narrative do you lay out for your story? Does it need to have a beginning and a middle and an end?
It absolutely must have a beginning, a middle, and an end. That is, to me, and I would probably say I am atypical for a historian who teaches at a university, in that I think more about writing and narrative more than other academics. But I think that's why my books appeal more to non-academics, is because those things really worry me and concern me and matter to me. So yes, every project starts with a beginning, middle, and an end. And that was why I did this third book, because the first book was it covered this one political party that existed for 6 years. That was pretty easy narrative. They start in 1853. They're dead by 1860, so a very easy beginning, middle, and end. And then the 5 Points book, the neighborhood's laid out in the 1820s. It fills with Irish immigrants. They move out, and it's filled with Italian immigrants. They move out, and it's filled with Chinese immigrants. And the story ends today. Although I stopped, there was a big urban renewal project and kind of half the neighborhood was torn down, so I stopped at that. And then had an epilogue that took it to today. And so the reason I chose this third book was I wanted a narrative challenge, because I thought, how can you possibly tell this story of all these immigrant groups over 400 years and make it readable? You know, my agent was aspiring for me to get a big advance for this book, given how the 5 points had done. So once I had finished writing the proposal, she said, you know, you're telling a compelling story about why this book will be successful, but she said, I think your proposal will be even better if you put a portion of the book in the proposal to show the publishers that you can write well, and that 5 points wasn't a fluke, and that and that you can write even more trade-like prose and less academic prose. So what I did was I wrote one section. It's actually if you look at the book, it's what's now the prologue to the book. It's the story of the first immigrant processed at Ellis Island, a girl named Annie Moore, who was an Irish immigrant, and I tell her story. And so I put that in the proposal. I gave it to my agent. My agent said,